Welcome to Centennial Conversations, a series of podcasts about the 100 years of Gavilan College. I'm Dana Young. I'm one of the librarians at Gavilan College, and today we're here with Leah Halper, who has just completed a history of the first 100 years of Gavilan College. Welcome, Leah.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for taking the time to do this.
Absolutely. I've always been interested in the history of Gavilan College. Starting with my first summer as a part-time librarian, I stumbled on boxes and boxes and cabinets of documents that had been left to the library at the library. And I'm really excited to have some order out of that chaos and to hear how it's being interpreted through the eyes of a historian. Today I'd like to start with the idea of why a college, why Hollister, why 1919? What is the, where did the idea of community colleges or junior colleges come from, and how were they a good fit for this area?
Ooh, big question. The idea came from so many places over a long time. There were, of course, pretty sophisticated vocational education systems throughout Europe with apprenticeship programs. But really, this is something new in human history, and it's very American in the sense of being from the United States. It's a pretty new idea because there was kind of a new social and economic organization in the United States, and industry needed educated workers, and the idea of a democracy is that everybody participates because they can understand what's going on and they have opinions about policy. So in the 19th century, pressure grew to not just have college be something that wealthy, privileged white men could access, take several years out of their life, relax, enjoy the ivory tower, but that this is something that should be accessible to other people. So it came from so many places, but two that I want to mention, there were a number of seminaries and academies for women that assumed a high school education and then gave people 2 more years so that they could become teachers. And single women began to be able to have some space to earn a living for themselves because of these academies. And then after Reconstruction, there were lots of African Americans in the South who desperately wanted an education, and the idea of a historically black college or university became very popular, but a lot of people couldn't afford 4 years. And so 2 years became a much more practical and skillful way to educate people so that they could really be helpful in their own communities. So the idea came from so many places, and it started to coalesce around 1900.
So at that time, there was a concept of a terminal degree being that 2-year degree, not just the idea of transferring, which is a more modern take on the community college. There
were advocates for both. Let's just say there were advocates for both, and they both make sense, and they both still make sense.
Absolutely.
And structured into the system in California, which jumped on the bandwagon very early because of what California is and who we have been for a long time. Those two ideas were really structured in.
Wonderful. And why was it such a good idea for this area? How did it take root here?
Can I start with California?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, I like to say when I'm talking about California in class, I like to quote something that I just think is hilarious and also really, really true. There's a saying, they tilted the United States and all the nuts and loose bolts fell to California. And it's an innovation machine. And the people who came here, in many ways, they didn't fit. My father's a good example. He didn't work out in Illinois. He came to California. He was very creative, and a lot of those people came here. And the industries that started to grow up required more educated workers. There's a boom and bust economy in California and kind of an expanding middle class. And the state fathers were very foresighted. They started UC Berkeley quite early. It's a world-class institution, and UCLA followed. But that wasn't enough. By, say, 1900, 1905, there was a big population and an expanding middle class, and people wanted other options. And there was a real hunger to learn and improve yourself and grab opportunities, very American.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
And then probably one other factor is the progressive movement, which stopped blaming people for being poor and kind of saying, well, it's your own fault and, you should work harder, and said, we need to give people opportunities and we need to take the barriers out of the way. And that's a powerful concept today, and it's really, those are the people who pressed for community college education. So California jumped on the bandwagon pretty early. The first community college in California actually is in my hometown of Fresno. Yeah. And the Fresno officials argued to the state that they deserved some funding because they were really far from Berkeley and UCLA, which were the only public options. There were private colleges such as Stanford, but, those are clearly for the wealthy.
Yes.
And the state said, yeah, okay, you're right. And so Fresno City College was founded in 1910. And every year or two for the next several years, one or two colleges here and there. And then there was a slight pause during World War I. And then in 1919, San Benito Junior College was founded in Hollister. So that's where our story specifically starts.
So what did it take to start a junior college in 1919?
It was kind of like the Wild West. If your high school district wanted to start a community college or a junior college, apparently it didn't take that much. But after 1917, things got a little more organized. California passed some enabling legislation called the Caminetti Act, which I think is interesting. It sounds like it's an Italian-American who sponsored that act, and I haven't had a chance to really look into that. But a high school usually it happened that a high school district decided, let's try this. And they simply announced that they were going to offer some college classes. They often used their existing faculty and same buildings, same diplomas. The one for San Benito Junior College is almost identical to the one that the high school was using. There's a slight difference in wording. And the state provided some support and a framework through the Caminetti Act and some funding. And vocational education quickly also realized, people in that field realized this is a really good way to provide that. But it wasn't really very difficult early on.
Wow. Well, it's interesting that the Caminetti Act would have been passed before the end of World War I.
I think one thing that's really important to say, in case I forget to say it later, is that I think by then people looked ahead and saw that we had an obligation to our veterans and that they deserved opportunities. But also one of the tropes about World War I that historians always bring up is that we found that a lot of the soldiers who went overseas, who were subjected to a variety of tests, including literacy tests, were actually really not very literate, and some of them were completely illiterate. So it awakened kind of a public sentiment that we should do better for our young people, I think generally in the United States.
Yeah. That's fascinating. So now as you said earlier, now we're here in San Benito County, and why did San Benito County Junior College begin? So you said that people just sort of had to decide they wanted to do it. How did San Benito County decide to begin the college?
That's a really good question, and I wish I knew for sure. Those are records that burned up in a fire in 1955 in Hollister. And so a lot of my work was trying to reconstruct using public records, which were hard to find. There wasn't much in the newspapers, but I found a little bit, and I was able to reconstruct kind of talking to a few very old people who weren't around yet in 1919 but had memories that reached backwards and so forth. So I think generally part of an answer is that it was far enough from San Jose. Norma Tribino told about in her period of kind of college education, which was in late 30s, early 40s, people were catching the train all the way from Hollister to go to San Jose Normal School. And that would have been the only option for people whose families couldn't afford to send them to Stanford or Berkeley for a full 4 years of being completely supported and not bringing in any income. You would live at home and you would, have room and board at least, and then train fare was not very expensive. So it was a way to elevate the town and boost it economically to try to bring in more college-educated people. And so its financial viability would be helped by having a college. But it's hard to know exactly what happened. But if we look at 1919, it's a year that historians talk a lot about.
Mm-hmm.
The war is over, but all of those lives, and in fact, the entire world really, it really was a world war, is completely disrupted.
The war to end all wars.
Supposedly, yes. Instead, 16 million people died. It led directly to World War II. It was incredibly disruptive. There was famine all over Europe. And the experience that the doughboys, the soldiers, including my grandfather from San Martin, that they had changed their lives forever. I mean, any kind of small-town farm boy innocence is going to be completely lost on the fields of Europe. So there's this huge trauma. The war also ended this whole system of monarchy in Europe, and it catapulted the United States to a global role that we've occupied ever since. But the United States really was very important in kind of how things are going to be settled after the war. So the tail end of the war, that's huge. Families are coping with loss. People are having to deal with their sons coming home traumatized or not coming home or coming home wounded. So it was all-out war. I mean, that's all the newspapers really had room for during World War I. And then it ended. But it ended just as, on its tail end, the largest influenza epidemic that we know of in human history caught hold. And that flu is related to the movement of troops in war. That's part of how it spread so quickly. There are all these people moving around, going back and forth. They called it the Spanish flu, but that's unfair. It was more connected to the war. And it was absolutely awful. Ironically, like the war, it was most dangerous to young people. Their immune systems were the healthiest, and they overreacted, and a lot of young people died. And in fact, way more died. 50 to 100 million people died of the flu than had died in the war.
Oh, my gosh. And so that was caused by the war and came back to the United States with the veterans?
They actually think it originated in Kansas and went with the veterans to Europe, spread all around Europe and the world, and then came back to the United States. But in any case, it had a huge impact everywhere, and it had a huge impact locally.
Yes.
So local businesses shut down. Communities passed mask ordinances so that if you were in public without a mask, you were arrested because they thought that, I'm not sure if the mask really did help. It would be interesting to ask a nurse. But in any case, the schools also shut down because parents, despite whatever the school system was saying, and there were pronouncements in the local papers, our schools are safe, parents wisely kept their children home for fear of contagion. So schools shut down. San Benito High School looked into offering a correspondence course, so its seniors in the academic year 1918 to 1919 could graduate on time.
Wow.
Everything shut down. It was a terribly dark time. Children were dying at New Idria School. That was shut down in the fall of 1919. One child died. All the other kids were sick. I mean, it was you can't exaggerate the impact of this flu. Everything stopped.
So that would have been in the early part of it's kind of mind-blowing that would be the time that you would say, hey, you know what? Not only are we going to reopen the school, but we're going to expand our services to include a junior college.
Yes, one wonders about that. And in the absence of evidence, you have to kind of think historically and think about, well, so why? So I have two possible reasons. One is in a situation that contemporary people will recognize, when your enrollments drop, which they did in that year because everybody stayed home, the year after, the state gives you way less money because it's based on last year's enrollments. So as everybody's flooding back to school and all sorts of new people are coming to school, you have more students and less revenue. So I'm not thinking that the officials at San Benito High said, let's open a college and we'll triple our revenue. But I'm guessing that they were trying anything they could think of to get a little bit more state revenue flowing in until they could kind of, recalibrate their enrollment and their funding. So maybe that was part of the reasoning. But I'd like to think that there's another bigger reason, which is that there were progressive people in this community who, in the midst of all this despair and disruption and darkness and the war and the deaths from the flu and the difficulties, who were committed to giving young people a chance at a better future, and who had a profound faith in the future of humanity and who wanted to invest in young people. And that's the explanation that I'm going to go with.
I like that explanation. I really do, because I do. There was a great optimism that this was the end of and we all know in hindsight, of course, that it wasn't. But if you look at a lot of the music and you look at a lot of the stories that came out of that time frame, there was an optimism.
There was going into the war. I think by 1919 it was pretty well beaten to death. I mean, I think that it was replaced by cynicism. But we don't really know when they started planning. I'm guessing sometime in 1918 because it was such a small thing to actually start the college. But I also wanted to say maybe that one other factor for us is there were ways that intelligent, interested people could educate themselves piecemeal in 1918, 1919, especially women. I'm thinking of women, but others too. You could be in a church that had occasional lectures from missionaries. There would be speakers who came through on a paid circuit. Sometimes vaudeville, you could go to a Shakespeare play or part of a play. You might be wealthy enough to go to San Francisco to experience some culture there or a museum. But generally speaking, and I'm thinking about Norma Trebino, one of my absolute favorite people in the world, who was 97 when I interviewed her. She had immigrant Italian parents, and her story is so similar to so many stories today, except that she was Italian, and today we might have Chinese immigrants or Vietnamese or Mexican, but her parents worked their tails off and managed to buy some land in Hollister, a lot of land actually. Land was cheap. Mm-hmm. And they had, I forget how many kids were in the family. Norma was the oldest. Those kids worked hard. Norma was a really good student, really smart, really dedicated to her studies, really curious and intellectually alive. And she got an hour every night. That's all she got to work on her homework. And she complained. She told her parents, I need more. But they had a farm. They had animals. She had younger brothers and sisters. This woman worked hard. She worked like an adult by the age of 10. And her mother knew she always wanted to be a nurse. And in fact, I think we should listen to part of her story about how that happened, how that came about. Were you able to work off the farm to earn some money?
On other farms.
Okay, so you worked on other farms.
I was very good at it.
What kind of work was it?
Digging grass from around trees, picking up brush, burning the brush after dinner until 9 o'clock at night. I'd hear my mother holler at me, Norma, it's time to come home. I'd be maybe a half a mile away, I could hear.
What did they pay you?
I don't remember. I saved all that money.
So then, when you wanted to go to the Santa Clara Hospital program, did you have to apply? You moved up there?
No, my mother, we had a Studebaker touring car, and she took me up there, and she talked with Miss Meikle, was the charge of the nursing program.
I'm interested that your mother could drive. Not every Italian woman could drive.
And she talked to Miss Meikle, and Miss Meikle said, well, she's from the farm. I don't think she's going to make it. But if she has the $70, we'll take her on a 6 months probation. And my mother says that I'm sure my mother was always positive. She was always backing you up. I could always depend upon my mother. And she talked to Miss Miko. She said, you know, my daughter's very responsible. She's well trained. She knows how to do things. Today I have a different name for what I did. She taught us, I think, anticipatory service.
Explain what you mean.
That you know what's going on around you and you know the next step or how to do something even better.
You're thinking ahead.
Yes. And that helped me a lot in nurses training. Anyway, I made it through the 6 months. And of course, I'm always in need of money. And my grandparents at that time had an Italian restaurant in San Jose, and sometimes on Saturday or Sunday I would work for them, and they'd give me $1.50.
So one of the things that strikes me about Norma's story is she was only at San Benito Junior College for a year. She didn't talk about it very much. She remembered small classes, good teaching. She had a good experience. She lived at home. Her family supported her. But without that year, nothing else that she did, and she had an extraordinary career, would have been possible.
And that was, you said, the 30s and 40s?
She was at San Benito Junior College probably in 39 or 40. She couldn't remember, and I couldn't find records one way or the other, just for a year. And then she transferred to a nurse training program at O'Connor Hospital, which lots of other people also mentioned. And they took her on probation. They weren't so sure about Norma Tribino. They made her pay all 3 years in advance, which was a lot of money, but her family found it. And they gave her 6 months probation. And she had a terrible struggle there. I mean, she bought a $5 bike. She rode everywhere, all around San Jose. She had to work a couple of jobs. She was working in the canneries during the cannery season. So friends of hers would take notes during class, and then she'd come home at midnight and study the notes. And then, just to make enough money so that she could eat, she saw at the hospital there was a backyard and there was kind of some land back there, and she asked the gardener if she could have a plot of land to grow vegetables to raise some money. So this woman is growing vegetables. She knew how to do that. She's Italian, right? You know, farm girl from Hollister. And people just came on the honor system and left her 25 cents for a big bag of tomatoes. That's how she got through college, nursing school.
So who came to the college? Where did the students come from in San Benito County?
So we have information about the 20s and the 30s. So I'm going to extrapolate and assume that there wasn't a big change and things were kind of similar in 1919. Generally speaking, they were graduates of San Benito High School.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, they were recruited in June for the September start of the college. The college started with 18 students when the high school started, and the only reason I know that is it was a little add-on after they explained all the glorious plans for the high school year and how many students were at the high school. And then the week after, actually, or 10 days later, there was another article in the paper, the Hollister Freelance, that said the junior college is proving popular, and now there were 35 students and 9 classes. And the biggest class with 91 students, which illustrates a point that the high school students were mixed in with the junior college
numbers,
students.
Yeah.
Yes, which became a real sore point and issue later. But it helped the college survive early on.
Sure.
The most popular class was psychology, which is true today too.
True today as well, yes.
So they came. Apparently, by the late 20s, it became clear to the high school board, which was kind of running the college, that if they could have bus service to the more rural parts of San Benito County, they would be able to increase both the number of students who were coming to the high school and decrease the truancy there, and also increase the number of people in community colleges. So I have some lovely stories from Muriel Winter Brem, who, again, she went later. She was there in the early 40s, but catching the bus. She was out at Tuttle Dairy on Fraser Lake Road, and she actually fell in love with her bus driver, and her parents didn't think that was a good idea. But anyway, maybe we could listen to that story.
How did you actually get to classes? Because they were in Hollister.
There was a bus. And in fact, I dated the bus driver. He was
you dated everybody.
Very cute. Yeah. It didn't matter who it was.
Was he your age, or was he an older guy?
He was my age.
Okay. So was the bus very full, collecting people from the world?
Yes, because it collected high school people as well as college. And the college was very small, very
During the
small.
war, it almost went away. Yeah. How small was it? Do you remember?
No. I don't remember.
How big were your classes?
Oh, maybe 7 or 8 people.
And actually, most of the recordings of the interviews you did will be available on our Community Matters local history archive. And so I just want to make a plug for that.
The one other thing I wanted to say about who came is I kept looking in the papers because there's no school district records because of this fire.
Right.
The people who would remember are dead. Their children don't seem to have been told, so they don't seem to know. So I kept looking. I looked for some kind of public fanfare, the press release, the college is opening, dun-da-da-da, we have a college.
Exactly. I was wondering, how would you find out if you weren't already a student at the high school?
Apparently, well, it's Hollister, word of mouth, but there was nothing I found in the year leading up to the college's opening that indicated that anybody knew anything or said anything in public. I'm sure there was documentation, but it doesn't seem to exist anymore until that first article that says, in the first week there are 18 students at the new JC.
I love it. And it shows kind of the power of a small town.
It does, and it also might be part of what we were talking about earlier, the kind of mood of death and destruction. I mean, maybe they didn't want to go out, saying, oh, we're going to start this big new thing. Aren't we wonderful, this bright new thing in our community? I think everything was a little muted and low-key, and certainly the first...
Understandably.
Yeah, the first social event the students had, that was in the newspaper that same December, and I was looking, social event, okay, what'd they do? Did they dance? Did they have refreshments? No, they had speakers. There were several people who spoke, and it didn't mention anything that sounded remotely fun, but, maybe in 1919, that's the kind of social event that was appropriate. Maybe these families had lost sons in the war. I mean, maybe that was exactly what they needed to do.
There may have been a period before it was comfortable to experience joy.
Yes.
Yeah. So what kind of extracurricular life, other than the speakers, so were there any dances? Or did they mostly combine with the high school for that kind of thing?
I think so. This is another kind of blackout period. I have more information from the 20s. I have so little from 1919. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, young people, they're going to have dances. We don't have enrollment records. We have graduation records, but there seems to be some evidence that both on the faculty, that I'm sure of, but also among the student body, women at the community college, or the junior college as they called it then, outnumbered men. For most of the first, until World War II, tended to have more women graduating. Now, maybe more men enrolled initially and then left after a year.
Right.
But, for work or whatever, or transferred. Yeah. A lot of women enrolled and got married. Muriel Brem talks about that. Yes. But generally speaking, this is a college that's serving women, and the initial faculty, and the faculty, as soon as I could start counting them, seemed to be majority women well into the 1940s.
Wow. On average, in the early years, do we have an idea of how big the graduating classes were?
Well, I desperately wanted that information.
Yeah,
of course, of course it's gone. But I did find one reference that helped us kind of maybe reconstruct it. Mm-hmm. In either the 1930 or the 1931 yearbook. I looked closely at both of them. There's a reference to, in our 11 or 12 years of being a college, we have attracted 700 students. So you can do the math and know that the first year was kind of small and, kind of figure out that maybe there was an average maybe of 80 or 90 enrolled. Mm-hmm. No part-time students. Everybody was full-time at that point, unless they got a special permission from the dean. So these are students who, like Norma, were living at home, saving money that way,
right,
but devoting themselves. And as you kind of noted earlier, a lot of them didn't come to transfer. Some of them did, but a lot of them came to just get more specialized knowledge or feel like they had a broader education.
Well, that educated middle class that you were talking about earlier, that's a really wonderful way of seeing the future and seeing yourself in the future. So one last thing, what kind of resources, you said that there was a fire and in the early days, and obviously the people who were directly involved are no longer with us. What kind of resources in general were you able to use to kind of recreate this early part of the college history?
Knowing local history at that time is really important, just having a sense of what's going on. So the newspapers are helpful for that. Knowing California and U.S. history at that time, so that because everything is in a context, even though Hollister is its own peculiar place in some ways, but it's also part of the larger world. That's really what I had to go on. And then the yearbooks start kicking in. They have San Benito High School yearbooks going pretty far back. I think I looked at a 1905 yearbook, which in very few particulars resembles a modern college yearbook, but there were a few. It's a pretty staid and dignified piece of publication. But so the yearbooks from the high school, although we don't have a college yearbook until 1930, not that they didn't exist, but we don't have one. Listening very closely to my oldest informants, who were born around 1919, 1920, 1921.
Oh, sure.
And whose memories reached a little back beyond themselves sometimes. That's what you have to go on. So you have to be careful saying, my sister was my proofreader. She's a very good proofreader. And she'd change something, and I'd write her, and I'd say, no, you can't say that. It has to say they may have, because she would write, they did. And I was like, no, we don't know. I'm not sure, because I have evidence that seems to point to it, but I don't have proof that was actually a fact.
So in some cases, you were forced to sort of fill in the blanks.
That's what historians do, but it's important to say when you know and when you think. For the whole conversation you and I just had about why they founded it then, I'm guessing, but I said I'm guessing, and then I also told why I think that those guesses are probably reasonable guesses.
Yes, and informed.
But the one thing I've learned in 25 years of teaching history is they keep discovering new things. You can't blow the dust off your history notes and use them year after year.
Yes.
The thing that you taught in 1995 as a settled historical truth has been completely upended by new evidence. And so you leave it open so that when new evidence comes, you can say, okay, well, we thought that it might have been this, but we see now, we have evidence that it was actually also this. Wow.
So bringing us closer to the next sort of phase of the college in the 30s and the 40s, and the next phase, of course, of America, what were the challenges that San Benito Junior College faced kind of in that now we're established, we've got troubling times at home and across America. What kind of challenges did they face?
Well, I'll be honest. I mean, I think the first one, and I just chuckled to myself all through, and as I talked to people in Hollister and San Benito County, these are conservative, tight-fisted people. And, even though the high school got state funding for the college and took most of it actually for itself, which is a whole other part of the story, it's astonishing to me that the college could continue to justify itself to these ranchers who, they don't like taxes. They don't want to spend an extra nickel. But I think, and being in Hollister and talking to people loved the idea that they could have this local institution they could be so proud of and that transformed their young people into kind of U.S. and world citizens from being these kind of farm boys and farm girls. And so I don't see a lot of pushback, and I keep looking for it. But that it survived at all, that it was funded at all, and that this community supported it, I think is a remarkable tribute to the people who founded the college and who called the shots in the first 20 years. So that's one problem. Then I think the relationship with the high school became, from a historian's point of view, increasingly problematic. You're really associated with the high school, and that's why a lot of people don't want to go to you, and they really want to leave town. And it's the same teachers. I talked to Elwood Dryden, who's 100 this year, and the founder of Sugar Plum Farm, and he said, it was just like high school, same teachers, same classrooms. There was, it didn't feel like you did it. You went anywhere. So overcoming that perception, which is still, I think, in a modern form, it's still a perception that we have to overcome. And I think one other thing that just knocked me flat, and I just was so interested to learn this and so encouraged, the academic standards were so high early on. When we talk next time, I'll tell you how San Benito Junior College attracted people from far and wide. And because of the academic standards, people were incredibly proud of the faculty, and the faculty's academic credentials were featured prominently in the yearbooks, and they all had masters, and a few of them had doctorates, and it told where they had each been educated. And it was really a point of pride how good an education people could get here and how they could sail right into UC Berkeley without missing a beat and, do well there.
And yet the hometown perception, that again, hometown does not always fully appreciate what they have sometimes.
And it's even more extraordinary an accomplishment because their students were also underprepared. Their students also had to work. Their students had a lot of responsibilities. So to uphold those high academic standards with those kinds of constraints. And then one last thing that I'll say, that now we're in the realm of informed guess rather than fact. Yes. But the fact was that the first graduating class in 1921, with their 2-year degrees, 8 women and 1 man. So I'm also guessing that although the community certainly wanted to support its daughters, these are not radicals in Hollister who think that women should have the vote and should have careers and should eschew marriage so that they can live productive, fulfilled lives as independent women making their own choices. So I imagine that the college had to also prominently support male students and, kind of trumpet all of the transfers that they were getting to.
Sure.
For a lot of women, this was a terminal degree, although some into the 30s and 40s are transferring. But I think it was probably a challenge for the college to explain that first graduating class. I mean, it happened all over higher education when women were allowed into institutions that had been completely male.
Yes.
They took over, and at UC Berkeley, they had to start excluding women from the top 10 because, a couple of years in a row, it was only women in the top 10 for the GPA.
Right.
So it's not an unusual story, but in Hollister, how that story got told probably had to get some care and some attention so that it was clear that the college was serving the male movers and shakers, future movers and shakers, and it wasn't just promoting a radical agenda for women who would then be independent of men.
And so does that have as much to do with the general roles that people saw men and women playing in general? I mean, was it more like you get your high school degree and you go to work, or you buy land, or you was there some kind of maybe change where it was okay to turn 18 and continue your schooling as a man?
I think every family was probably different, but in general, I would say that all the men who could have afforded the luxury of going to college and who were interested probably really welcomed the opportunity. And it was that the opportunity didn't exist for so many decades. And once the opportunity existed, I think men who could afford to do it really took the opportunity. But the war took its toll. I mean, that whole cohort of men was severely disrupted by the war. So that's another reason why probably, again, we don't have enrollment statistics, but we have graduation statistics. Yes. The men were all either recovering or dead, or from the war. So that's another, working with veterans, as we know in our own community college era, is challenging and important, and it takes some special skills and some special programs. Yeah. And we don't really know what they had. We know that veterans were honored, but we don't know how that looked at San Benito Junior College.
Well, this has been wonderful. I can't wait to sort of go into the next phase of the history of the college, where we have maybe a little more of the record, and we're closer to having people who can convey their own stories from that time period. We'll be gathering together next time here at Gavilan College.